We will go ahead and start our program. Welcome. We're going to first get started with some introductions. I am Dr. Renee Poole, Vice President of the Association of Black Women Physicians, and I welcome you to our presentation today on the cannabis updates, both health and legal implications of recreational and medicinal use.
Hi, my name is Michelle Kozadi. I'm the President-elect of Black Women Lawyers Association of Los Angeles. Did we want to introduce the President of Association of Black Women Physicians? So Dr. Sylvia Gates Carlisle is here, and she will give some welcoming remarks.
We are definitely living in interesting times. It's hard to believe that we are together but not together, but I wanted to give honor to our predecessors in both organizations, the Association of Black Women Physicians and Black Women Lawyers, because this symposium represents a 4-decade collaboration. Number one, existing for 4 years, 44 decades is impressive, and to continually collaborate to try and improve outcomes for our community in our shared work is a significant honor to the people who came before us, and we're committed to continuing to work. We really appreciate the choice of marijuana as a topic at this particular time. Traditionally, marijuana prosecutions have demonstrated significant disparities between us and our community, and now that marijuana is cool and legal, we want to know how to best utilize its benefits and to know how to protect ourselves. So this is a collaboration with clinical and legal expertise, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks again to our sister organizations and our sisters, and we have lots of work to continue to do. Thank you.
But thank you very much for those kind words. So now I'm going to introduce the panelists for this evening. We have an amazing group of physicians and lawyers and researchers that have a wealth of experience and knowledge on this topic. So the first one is Dr. Rosalie Pakula. Dr. Pakula is a full professor in the Elizabeth Garrett Chair in Health Policy, Economics and Law in the Sol Price School of Public Policy and the Leonard D. Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics at the University of Southern California. Her research focuses on issues related to illegal or imperfect markets, healthcare markets, insurance markets, legal and illicit drug markets, the measurement of these markets, the impact they have on behavior, and the effectiveness of policy interventions at targeting behavior. Dr. Pakula was the lead investigator of several NIH studies examining the impact of marijuana liberalization policies, decriminalization, medicalization, and legalization on use in public health, as well as their impact on the use of other substances, alcohol, prescription opioids, and heroin. She was part of research teams providing guidance to Washington State, Vermont, and Canada on their legalization initiatives, focusing on public health aspects of these laws. In 2017, she served on NIDA's National Advisory Council on Drug Abuse Cannabis Policy Work Group, and this past December was invited to be a part of the World Health Organization's Technical Expert Committee on Cannabis Use and Cannabis Policy. So Dr. Pakula, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's really quite an honor to be here with you all this evening. I was asked to provide a few opening remarks about my understanding. As an economist, I approach the study of marijuana policy really from a markets perspective. And it's really important when you think about how these markets have evolved. They're a function of the laws that have been put in place, but those laws were put in place with certain objectives. Both in the US states as well as in Canada, when legalization efforts were pushed forward, the main idea of the policies were really to try to get rid of the black market. That was a primary objective, to stop criminalizing, raise it again. Let me first get back to this issue of new products. And I'm showing here on the slide, for those of you who can see them, a graph of the sales of different products that opened in the state of Washington, starting from the first day the markets opened in July of 2014 until September of 2017. And this dark blue base, that is the biggest growth in the market is the sale of flower products that were sold to consumers. This is what people actually bought in stores. Right above that, a growing differential in this light blue part of the graph are the growth in extracts and concentrates of cannabis. Purple, the next layer, represents edibles, which were initially a big public health concern when they came out because of a lot of accidental poisonings that occurred with edibles. When they're taken out of the wrapper, they look just like normal products and can be accidentally digested by children and the like. In actuality, in Washington, that wasn't as big a part of the market. And then there's this green area, which is just a composite of other products. And what you can see is that while flower dominates the products, all the sales in Washington state, the fastest growing segment of the market is concentrates. Washington state is not alone. Here now on the left-hand side, I'm showing you this, what happened in Oregon. It's a state right next to Washington. And when it opened, initially it opened and only medical marijuana stores could sell cannabis initially until the full law came into effect in October of 2016, at which point new rec stores could open. And unlike Washington state, where there was a gradual move and expansion into concentrates and extracts, in Oregon, we see an immediate jump in the share of sales that go to extracts. Why am I paying so much attention to extracts and concentrates as a product? Research has shown us, again, looking at the sales of the products that are being sold in Washington state, as well as in Oregon, that extracts, cartridges that get put in vape pens, hashish, the extract in oils and dabs, the potency of these products in terms of THC, which is the main psychoactive ingredient of cannabis, is substantially higher than that of flower. In Washington state, average potency of flower material that I am trying to circle on here now is about 21% THC, where the average potency of extracts and concentrates is on the order of 69 to 74% THC. What I'm showing you in this graph is the interquartile range of potencies of all products sold in Washington state during the period of 2014 to 2018. And what's important is that these are the most popular products being sold, while a lot of users, and particularly medical users, are interested in having products that contain equal amounts of CBD and THC, because that's where the therapeutic benefits often come from. What we found in the seed to sale system is that even when there are equal parts THC to CBD, the average potency of the products being sold, again, this is in Washington state, is around 40% THC and 40% CBD. Why is that so important? The health effects of these high potency products has not been evaluated in any of our scientific studies. Most of the bench science that we have, as well as the science from public health impacts, are on THC products that are in the range of 7 to 14% THC. So these are really products on the market of unknown impact in terms of their addictive potential, in terms of their risk of psychoses, and yet we are seeing rising escalation rates for certain public health events. Does this mean that this is a dangerous product and we have to get it off the market? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the way our laws are currently designed, where we do not set any maximum on the amount of THC, the industry is pushing a market that is geared towards higher potency, because the higher potency is what makes people more likely to become addicted. The legal risks under legalization are clearly much better in that we are no longer incarcerating many adults. Under Prohibition, Blacks and Hispanics were certainly disproportionately arrested and convicted for drug possession. Under legalization, arrests for all groups have fallen. However, the differential, again, between whites and these other ethnic minorities has not diminished. Unfortunately, Blacks and Hispanics are still highly overrepresented in arrests, particularly compared to their use rates. Part of the reason we believe this to be true is that under legalization, youth are continuing to get arrested. It is not legal for youth to use. And unfortunately, this is where the minorities are being significantly overrepresented in arrests. So I'll stop my opening comments with that and hand it on to the next speaker.
So seeing no questions currently, I'm going to move on to our next panelist, who is Shahida Palmer. Shahida Palmer is an associate attorney with Arndt Fox, LLP. As a land use attorney, she facilitates entitlement of commercial, hotel, and multifamily residential projects throughout the Bay Area on behalf of property owners and developers. As a regulatory cannabis attorney, she also assists businesses throughout California in compliance with local and state cannabis laws and supports deals involving the merger and acquisition of cannabis enterprises and licenses. Shahida is a Chicago native who graduated from Harvard Law School, and she also earned her MBA from Woodbury University. Shahida, happy to see you tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michelle. I am happy to be here. As Michelle mentioned, a big component of my current practice is counseling cannabis businesses. So these are companies that are currently operating in the cannabis space. Previous to joining Arndt Fox, I worked in the county counsel's office in the county of Los Angeles, and I helped to develop a lot of the policy there related to business licensing, public health, taxes, pretty much the gamut of policies that the county was considering related to legalized cannabis use at the county level. So I'm really excited to be here. Personally, decriminalization of cannabis use is really important to me. And so I'm really happy to be on the panel this evening. So I just want to start with some basics from the legal perspective. Even though cannabis use is legal in about 10 states, in some states it's legal for medicinal use only. In other states like California, it's legal for medicinal and recreational use. It is still a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act under federal law. So that's just an important caveat to be aware of as we, go about our lives, as we travel. There have been a lot of instances where people get into trouble carrying marijuana out of state, across state lines. That's when the Controlled Substances Act comes into play. And so it's just something to still be cautious about. We're protected here within the boundaries of the state of California, but the rules are very different in other places. Another interesting point that's pretty relevant today is that while we're in the shelter in place or staying at home as a part of the COVID-19 response, in a lot of cities throughout California, including the city of Los Angeles, including San Francisco, and a bunch of other cities in the Bay Area, cannabis dispensaries have been identified as essential services. So they are allowed to continue operating. You can continue to visit these businesses and obtain legal licensed cannabis and cannabis products. Also, an interesting component of the COVID-19 situation is in a lot of cities, because the Prop 64 and the state law allowed local jurisdictions significant discretion in what they continue to allow at the local level. A lot of cities continue to ban dispensaries. They continue to ban delivery of cannabis. But because now we're social distancing and we're sheltering in place, in a lot of those cities where delivery was not previously allowed, it is allowed now. So if you are looking to obtain products without leaving your house, that's a new option that could be more widely available than it was in the past. In California, 21 years of age or older for recreational non-medical use. You don't need a license to use it. You can still use marijuana if you're 18 years of age or older if you have a medical recommendation for use. And generally the baseline amount that you can legally have is 1 ounce of the flower, 8 ounces of the concentrate, like the vapes. But there are special licenses and recommendations for higher amounts of products. Even though use is legal here in California, there are some restrictions that continue to apply. For example, you cannot have an open container in an operating vehicle. You can still get a DUI for driving under the influence of cannabis. There are also, like Dr. Pakula mentioned, some restrictions that really make sure that minors don't have easy access to marijuana. So it's not lawful to consume cannabis near a school or other places where children congregate, like daycare centers or after-school centers, or generally on public property. And there are also restrictions that private parties and government agencies can impose on their property and within the boundaries of their programs. So public agencies can prohibit use of cannabis. They can do drug testing. And we've seen cases where people have gotten evicted out of public housing for using marijuana. We've seen cases where private apartment complexes do prohibit use on property, and they have evicted people for using it. And in addition, employers can still have a zero tolerance policy. And if they do drug testing, you can still be disciplined according to your employer's policy for using marijuana, even though it's legal in California. One thing that I wanted to just point out today is, again, kind of going back to this war on drugs and the disparate impact that we've seen in enforcement in minority communities, is now that cannabis is legal, people have different reactions. So what I tend to see is two extremes. One extreme is people are really excited about it, and they almost have this sense of unbridled entitlement. Yes, it's legal. I'm going to smoke wherever I want, and nobody can tell me anything, which means you're getting into some violations possibly of the restrictions that are in place. You might go to work in violation of your employer policy. You might drive and smoke in violation of the DUI laws. So that extreme unbridled entitlement reaction is like freedom can get people into trouble. The other extreme that I see is really the opposite, and it's more of a denial and a forced suppression that stems from this history of stigma. We've been targeted historically for using marijuana, cannabis, at a higher rate than we've been using them in proportion to the general public. So some people may not use marijuana as an alternative to other more extreme, more harmful drugs, even though they might be eligible to use it for treatment for a particular illness. People might also avoid the legal markets and continue to use the black market because they don't want to be, quote unquote, in the system. They don't want to sign up for a membership. They don't want to get a medical recommendation. So they end up continuing to use products that are not licensed, are not regulated, and could be harmful just because they don't want to be associated with cannabis because of the stigma that has been a part of it historically. And just as a reminder, of course, illegal, unlicensed sales are still illegal. Another component that I wanted to just bring up today is related to what I call reparations. Really, it's, again, going back to the detrimental impacts of the war on drugs. As a part of legalization in California, we've seen two components of reparations, one in the business licensing aspect, the other in the criminal justice reform. With business licensing, cities like Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, they have implemented these programs that allow minority applicants to basically compete on a more on par level with deeper pocket companies, larger tobacco companies that are getting in the space by just helping them to be competitive applicants to get licenses. The City of LA's program didn't work out very well, though, and they're actually facing a really big lawsuit by a group of minority business owner applicants who were harmed by a glitch in the system. So that's a pretty interesting case if anyone's interested. I can talk more about that later. But with respect to criminal justice reform, Prop 64 created a program that allowed people to get marijuana-related convictions expunged. That program was really complicated, though, and it placed the burden on the individual to apply for relief. There was a law that took effect last year that now makes that process pretty much automatic. I say pretty much because there are still a few steps and there's some discretion at the district attorney level. So if you know anyone that has been convicted of a marijuana-related offense in California, they are one of about 200,000 people that the state estimates could be eligible for relief under this program, this expungement program. And it's worthwhile to, if you or anyone you know has a marijuana conviction on your record, go and get your rap sheet, get your criminal record, see if there is a charge. If there is, contact the county district attorney's office where that charge was handled, and see if you might be able to speak to someone and see if you're eligible for that expungement process. This can have tremendous impacts down the road on jobs, education, all sorts of other aspects of life. And it's part of, you know, what got these laws passed. And so it's up to us all really to hold, you know, the politicians and the legislators accountable and make these programs work. So I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Well, we do have a couple of questions. Let's go ahead and give you some, okay? So the first question is, why is it not advertised that marijuana is illegal for the youth?
That's a good question. And I think it's something that just comes into how laws are communicated and marketed to the public. So in California, the law that's on the books now is the adult use law. So it's the medical and adult use law. So it's kind of built into the law. And it's just assumed that, you know, the general public will understand that if, you know, minors can't smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol, that they also won't be able to use marijuana.
And then another question with regards to our youth, is it a criminal offense for a parent to provide cannabis to their addicted teenager?
To provide cannabis to their addicted teenager? That's a good question. And I think it's important to look at a couple of different factors there. So, you know, you have, I don't know if the teenager is 18 or 19. If they are 18 and they're eligible to, you know, go and apply for their own medical recommendation, I would recommend that they do that. And then the parent and the minor would be protected in that way because the minor would have their own medical recommendation. But, you know, under the law as it is now, it's the lawful use is limited to either adults 21 years of age and older or 18 years of age and older with a medical prescription. I've seen stories, I'm sure we all have, and the other panelists can speak to this probably better, of, you know, trials for medical treatment. And so I'm not directly familiar with how that plays into the law here, but if any of the doctors have an opinion on that.
Oh, I was just going to say, because of how the law is currently written, it specifies that it is a criminal offense to provide, for an adult to provide cannabis to a minor. It doesn't specify the nature of the relationship. So unfortunately, it's possible if the minor is not protected through a medical allowance that there's the potential for a criminal offense. Although what happens in the home, I think, is unlikely to be known unless it's a public area.
Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Jane Steinberg. Dr. Steinberg is an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Preventative Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. She has worked in the field of public health for over 25 years in nonprofit, government, and academic settings. Her research focuses on reducing health disparities with a focus on adolescent health, tobacco control, and best public health practices and cannabis regulation at the local level. Dr. Steinberg received her BA in psychology from UC Davis and MPH, PhD from the Fielding School, UCLA Public Health. Dr. Steinberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and very happy to be here tonight. So thank you, everyone. So I think where I wanted to start was a lot of what we know about cannabis legalization is what we see in the news around the economic issues, impacts, around the costs, incarceration. What I would like to focus on is some of the public health considerations for cannabis legalization that are not often at the forefront of discussions. And I know some of our former speakers did touch upon these, so there may be a little bit of repetition, but hopefully not too much. So with that, oh no. Okay. So just to give a little bit of background, very briefly, Proposition 64, as Ms. Palmer discussed before, was passed in 2016 in California. This allows for the legalized possession and use of cannabis by adults 21 years and older for recreational or non-medical use. Small amounts of cultivation are also allowed for personal use. You can have 6 plants for your personal use. And as was discussed before, some key parts of Prop 64 included reparations for communities that were harmed by the war on drugs, primarily African American, Latino communities, which included sentencing reforms, as was discussed, expunging records for marijuana possession and use, and a reclassification of some crimes from felony to misdemeanor to redress the communities that were harmed by drug policy. A few other key parts of Prop 64 include community reinvestment grants, drug and alcohol treatment, and economic opportunity. And as was referred to earlier, California's Cannabis Equity Grant Program provides aid to local jurisdictions to support equity applicants who've been left out of the cannabis legal industry to spur economic opportunity in these communities. But what I'm also going to focus on tonight is the regulatory framework which Proposition 64 set up to allow cultivation, distribution, manufacturing, testing, and the area that I'm going to speak about most is the retail sale environment of commercial non-medical cannabis. So if we look to 2018, the state of California began issuing retail licenses to local businesses. So cities and counties in California can choose whether or not to allow or ban cannabis retail businesses, dispensaries. Most cannabis businesses in California need both a state as well as a local license in order to operate. And as of this month, about 75% of California cities and local jurisdictions and counties ban the sale of cannabis or dispensaries. All right. What I wanted to do was step back a little bit and provide kind of an overview when we talk about public health best practices in regulating the retail environment of cannabis. A lot of what we see has come from the tobacco control world, where for years, as we know, tobacco companies had been marketing to youth, had been marketing to communities of color, and in sort of a best case scenario, experts in the field of tobacco control have argued for the need to regulate cannabis like we do tobacco. Now, in many ways, we regulate cannabis the way we regulate alcohol. That's a little bit of a different discussion. But what I wanted to do is just lay out what would be some of these best practices for regulating cannabis retail. And this comes from primarily from UC San Francisco, Stan Glantz and Rachel Berry, who've done a lot of work in this area. So the first would be tax revenue. You need tax revenue that's sufficient to cover costs, particularly of enforcement, revenue to cover prevention, control, and research. You want to have prevention and control programs, specifically media campaigns that are targeted more generally to the public and also to youth and other groups that may be at risk for use, and also to maintain smoke-free laws. So smoke-free laws that would prohibit public use, to have cannabis laws that are consistent with your tobacco laws, and to protect local control, meaning that local jurisdictions would have the ability to adopt stronger laws than maybe what is currently being, what the law is at the statewide level. Marketing and advertising. Anyone who drives down Highway 5 in downtown Los Angeles, going up to the Bay Area, you've seen plenty of billboards. Strong marketing and advertising prohibitions would prohibit advertising that appeals to youth or that makes therapeutic claims. There's a lot of lack of information and misinformation about the benefits as well as the harms of cannabis. So marketing and advertising is really key here. Licensing rules. You want to have serious penalties for underage sales. Currently in California and all other states, I believe, that have regulated cannabis, you cannot sell alcohol and tobacco where you're selling cannabis, although that may change over time. And then at the retail level, it's very important to have age verification standards at the point of sale. Note and other things such as no retailers within a 1,000-foot area of underage or sensitive areas like drug treatment programs. So that has actually been part of the law across states. Is there some boundaries where you don't have dispensaries within a certain number of feet of these areas? And critically, to have product standards. And this is the role of usually of state health departments, who what they do is they are legally required to test cannabis products regularly, as well as set up requirements for labeling and packaging and quality control, and ideally to require strong potency limits, no additives, no flavors or packaging that might appeal to youth. Now, I should just stop and say this is not what is necessarily happening in California or across the US, but this would be kind of considered your best practice model, and most states are doing elements of this, maybe just not all. And then the bottom would be to provide warning labels modeled on tobacco labeling. One important point is that a public health concern is that we know there's been changing social norms around cannabis. Cannabis is used by many different people, some good, some not so good effects. Part of the normalization and the increased acceptance of cannabis with legalization has been a real perceived less of a perceived risk of harms, particularly among youth. Many who feel that or think that cannabis is harmless, and that is worrisome given the emerging evidence that has come out regarding chronic cannabis use among youth, which can lead to mental health, cognitive functioning issues, brain development delays, psychoses, and other mental health concerns, and of course increased risks of motor vehicle accidents. So it's a very delicate balance. With legalization comes the responsibility to provide, again, the benefits as well as the harms. And that is something that is critically important. So what I want to talk about is one area that I think really has been discussed, but not really looked into in detail in terms of some of the health impacts. So in California, recently, the LA Times came out with a study that showed that there are nearly 3,000 unlicensed retailers or dispensaries, as well as delivery services operating in California. This is a problem compared to, I can't see, I think it's 873, compared to 873 licensed cannabis sellers, according to the California Bureau of Cannabis Control, which licenses cannabis retailers. So we have a huge illegal, unlicensed market. There's a number of contributing factors, but I want to touch on the ones that I think are the most salient. We did have a loosely regulated medical cannabis market in California prior to 2016. So medical cannabis had been legal in California since I think 1996, originally used or advocated by people with HIV who needed some pain management. So the advocate community was really strong in California. So we've had sort of a history of cannabis legalization for a number of years. But that plus the lack of enforcement against unlicensed sellers has created what we call a whack-a-mole situation, where you have an unlicensed dispensary, the enforcement comes in, closes it, and then another dispensary opens up down the block. So it's been a real challenge to keep the black market, as it were, the unlicensed dispensaries out of the market. And it's a lot cheaper. People can get, the unlicensed dispensaries do not pay the excise and the sales taxes that the legal dispensaries do. So it's created a real problem. But for where we sit, this is important health implications, particularly for vulnerable communities. So a study that some of my colleagues and I did, looking at unlicensed dispensaries across the state of California, found that compared to the licensed retailers, unlicensed retailers were more likely to be concentrated in economically disadvantaged areas with high concentrations of Latino and African American populations, primarily located in LA County, and primarily located in unincorporated areas of the state, as well as local jurisdictions that allowed retailers. So why is it important? Why would there be so many unlicensed dispensaries in the unincorporated areas? Well, the unincorporated areas do not have what's the word I'm looking for. There is not a local presence of a city council. And so because of that, the county is responsible for the unincorporated areas, and you have much less attention to and enforcement efforts in these unincorporated areas. And about 1 million people, at least in Los Angeles County, live in a number of unincorporated areas. And so unlicensed dispensaries can really sort of set up and evade detection by authorities. That has been changing, but we still have a large number in these unincorporated areas in the state of California, but primarily LA County. And a study by the LA County Department of Public Health of unlicensed dispensaries also found that compared to the licensed retailers, the unlicensed ones were more likely to experience violent crimes on site at their stores. They were more likely to sell and promote on-site consumption of high potency cannabis products that Dr. Pakula was speaking to earlier, high THC contents such as moon rocks or wax, and also provided free use of devices designed to maximize THC inhalation. And unlicensed retailers were less likely to have visible security personnel on site and more likely to sell products that were designed to be attractive to youth and that were not in child-resistant packaging, which is a requirement under state law. All right, so really, cannabis products that are sold in the unlicensed market pose health risks because products sold in these venues are not subject to state testing. So as of June 2019, the California Department of Public Health linked over 60 cases of acute lung disease to individuals who had recently used vape devices, many of which were purchased from unlicensed cannabis retailers. So there's often pesticides, and the unlicensed markets are not held to the same standards as the licensed one ours is, which can really create some health issues. And the unequal distribution of cannabis retailers could potentially exacerbate health disparities if racial and ethnic minority and low SES neighborhoods are really bearing the brunt of youth initiation, cannabis-related health emergencies, and crime without receiving the associated tax revenue. So we don't know this of yet, but this is something that's really important to stay on top of. The LA County study, this was a health impact assessment that they did, also has noted that as more cannabis social equity businesses come online, it will be important to track the locations and the health equity impacts of allowing licensed now dispensaries in the county's unincorporated areas due to the oversight and enforcement concerns that I raised earlier. And it is suggested that a carefully crafted local ordinance, as well as strong administrative penalties for unlicensed operators, would be more effective than a criminal justice approach. So this would be things like fees, turning off, electricity, educating the neighborhood about these businesses. So that's something that we want to kind of keep on top of, is now that we have a legal market, making sure that it's a legal market that rises to the health standard. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions here. What makes someone eligible to be an equity applicant?
maybe Ms. Palmer knows this better than I do. There's a number of criteria, and I think it also depends on the city that you're in and the state that you're in. But I mean, I have a laundry list, but maybe Ms. Palmer, you might know at the top of your head faster than I do.
Sure. So it really does depend on the jurisdiction that you are interested in doing business in, because the social equity programs are implemented by local ordinance and regulations. So for example, in the city of Los Angeles, social equity applicants can fall into one of 3 tiers. And just kind of as an example, the tier 1 category is a person who has been convicted of a cannabis offense and is low income, and they define low income, and you've been a resident for at least 5 years in one of a specified number of zip codes. So you'll want to look at the cannabis department or cannabis regulatory agency's website for the city that you're interested in. And for Los Angeles, it's cannabis.lacity.org.
Okay, very good. And we do have another comment and question. What efforts to enforce non-smoking of marijuana in public venues, such as concerts, can be enacted?
So non-smoking as in edibles? I wasn't quite sure.
It says non-smoking of marijuana, so I guess edibles. Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. We're not even able to get law enforcement to enforce smoking right now. You walk down any street, it's there. So I think that's a really good question that the participant asked. But to be honest, I think law enforcement right now is focusing more on the issue of drug driving than they are people using smoking, vaping, or eating. But I agree. I think it's an important question that remains to be seen, particularly since we've only had licenses since 2018 and a number of cannabis dispensaries are not online yet.
All right.
And can I jump in and add a point? So when I was working for the county council in Los Angeles, enforcement was very challenging for all the reasons that Jane mentioned. You know, the county is huge, and the law enforcement agency for the county is the sheriff's department, which has, you know, several functions, including operating the jails. And what we saw really early on is law enforcement, just like there's confusion among the general public about what's allowed and what's not allowed and what is considered medical and what's not. In the law enforcement community, there was this sense of, well, we don't know if we're taking someone's medication and we're going to get sued under the ADA, or we're going to get in trouble for that. So they were, you know, hesitant to enforce against, you know, use in public places, because it was just such a touchy gray area. And now that so many people are using it, you know, like has been said, they have other priorities, and they're really focused on, at least in my recollection, they were focused on the source of the sales, so shutting down the illegal dispensaries for the bigger impact, as opposed to targeting individuals.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. And just to jump in really quickly, we also know that secondhand cannabis vape and smoke is not benign. It has a whole host of chemicals that can be of harm. I saw someone in the Q&A mention the odor. That's one part of it, but it's really the issues that the chemicals that we're concerned about as well.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any more questions, Dr. Poole, or no? Okay, so let's get our last panelist in on this discussion. Our last panelist this evening is Dr. Ricky Bluthenthal, and I hope I said that correctly. He's an Associate Dean for Social Justice and Professor in the Department of Preventative Medicine in the Institute for Prevention Research at the Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California. His research has established the effectiveness of syringe exchange programs, tested novel interventions to reduce HIV risk and improve HIV testing among people who inject drugs and men who have sex with men, documented how community conditions contribute to health disparities, and examined health policy implementation. At present, Dr. Bluthenthal is conducting studies on preventing injection, initiation, and examining substitution of cannabis for opioids, and I can't say that word, opioids among people who inject drugs. Welcome, Dr. Bluthenthal. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Happy to be here with this distinguished group of panelists. And so today I'll just talk about the work that we're doing and the rationale for it, looking at the substitution of cannabis for opiates. So I come to this work with almost 30 years of experience conducting research on preventing health problems and doing drug use epidemiology among people who inject drugs. So both first in the Bay Area, lately in Los Angeles, but I've been at it for a long time. And so the cannabis legalization offers, I think, an opportunity for that particular subpopulation that's high need. So I'll just provide you some of the rationale for that, some of the preliminary evidence for it, and then just some concluding thoughts about where we're going with cannabis. So owing mostly to the prescription opiate crisis, there are multiple epidemics going on that impact people who inject drugs. So those are mostly heroin and methamphetamine users. Obviously, there's the well-reported ongoing overdose death crisis, but less well-known, but as significant is we are in the midst of a national hepatitis C epidemic. There are also signs of a national skin and soft tissue epidemic. If you look at the hospitalization data, there's growing drug-related infective endocarditis cases reported in every region of the country. And then more lately, we've been having these HIV outbreaks in some places unexpected, like rural Indiana, and then some places that are a bit more common, like Seattle, Washington. So anything we can do to move people away from injection drug use has some inherent public health value. When you look at the patient reports for people who use medicinal cannabis, they report using it as a substitute for other drugs, including prescription drugs. There's a couple of studies that I sort of outlined there. There are preliminary studies from my own work, where we're seeing evidence that people endorse that as one reason for using cannabis, although not at these rates. So in my sample of long, chronic opiate use disorder individuals, about 20% report using cannabis as a substitute for opiates. So it's a lot less popular in this population than it is in others. But if it actually works, it has multiple benefits for them in a way that it may not for other groups. So these are just a couple of studies that have been published over the last 5 or 6 years looking at this topic. This study by my colleague Alex Kroll in San Francisco did qualitative interviews with the same group of long-term heroin and meth users. And what you see highlighted is that people talk about, as they've transitioned into sort of lower intensities of drug use, that cannabis sort of facilitates that process for them. This is, again, another report that Alex and I did together, looking at the same population in Los Angeles and in San Francisco. And we found that people who reported cannabis use had lower levels, lower frequencies of opiate use, and again, in the same subpopulation. Now, this research is a longitudinal analysis from some of our colleagues in Vancouver, British Columbia. And they found, again, that more intensive patterns of cannabis use seem to be associated with lower levels of opiate use. And in this case, also opiate injection or heroin injection. Felix Lucas, who's been doing a lot of the patient studies in Canada for quite some time, has sort of outlined a causal pathway for understanding how cannabis might work to reduce opiate use. It can also work to reduce injection drug use, and then, of course, overdose And then there's some evidence, because cannabis is a pain reliever, that it might be used to deal with opiate withdrawal symptoms. And that could have other sort of health benefits down the line. So this is sort of just a little schema thinking about how you might use cannabis with this sort of chronic opiate using and meth using population. So for folks who don't use cannabis at all, offers of using it as a way to deal with opiate withdrawal, which is a very common occurrence. In the last study where we looked at this, about 87% of people who used heroin or any kind of opiate reported withdrawal symptoms in the last 6 months. And most people, or not most people, about 40% reported weekly. So it's a sort of common problem. If cannabis could help alleviate that, you would end up perhaps reducing HIV by reducing syringe sharing. That would also help with hepatitis C. And then you could also offer it for opiate reduction. For people who already report medicinal use, I think there's an opportunity to begin exploring different levels of potencies or the properties of the strains to see if any of them have any positive impacts on either pain, withdrawal symptoms, or opiate use. And then for folks who only report recreational use, which in my population is the vast majority of folks, there's an opportunity again, if we begin systematically looking at potencies and properties, the ratio of THC to CBD, to maybe discover ways in which this might be of medicinal value to this population. Some of this work is already going on, again, in Vancouver. I contributed to this study. They've done a qualitative study looking at some free dispensing of cannabis to these sort of low-income injection drug users and non-injection drug users. And people, there's a lot of acceptability for the program. People report it obviously helps them with affordability issues. And this wasn't mentioned before, but Canada's system of legalization is a little bit different. And I may be getting this wrong, so Rosalie can correct me. But the legal system there, the legal pot is sold by the government. And so the prices are still quite high. I think there's still a pretty vibrant black market as a consequence. And so basically folks in my group that I'm interested in don't really have access to it because in the legal market, because the prices are high, these folks are sort of giving it out. And so that increases access. People are talking about lower barriers. And so there's an opportunity, I think, to begin exploring how this might be a benefit to this high need population. So to get there, though, and I've been really, I've been very disappointed about how this is rolled out and the absence of attention to this sort of medicinal use, the absence of interest even by commercial entities and supporting research that begins to carefully look at these products, look at the combination of THC to CBD, look at the other CBDs, look at the different routes of administration, to figure out if there are some medicinal benefits. For basically 40 years, lots of people have said, oh, it has these medicinal benefits, but we can't study it because it's not legal. And now that it's legal, I'm afraid to report that we're not seeing very rigorous studies done to sort of figure out how it actually could be helpful for high need populations. So one approach, and I think this is sort of what's happening in Vancouver, is although in an uncontrolled way, there's an encouragement design where you sort of identify subpopulations who maybe report using it to deal with emotional regulation or for substitution patterns or for pain relief. And then, begin doing what we would do in any other medication, which is to carefully control the dose, carefully control when it's administered, and then begin to do the hard work of establishing whether there's some efficacy. So that's what I'd like to see happen moving forward. There's some other issues too about how people use it in combination with other drugs. As someone who studied drug use for 30 years, I'm sorry to report that we've done a very poor job of understanding polysubstance use. And in fact, most of the drug use that happens in combination with other things. So alcohol and cigarettes, cigarettes and cannabis, cannabis and heroin. And so we need new methods actually to understand the way populations are using these drugs to achieve these sort of other health-related benefits. So thank you for having me. That's the extent of my comments.
Thank you so much. We do have a question here for you. Is CBD equally or more effective for pain management compared to THC?
Well, my understanding, again, we probably need someone who works on the sort of molecular level of cannabis, but my understanding is that most of the pain relief is actually in the THC, but I'm happy to be corrected about that. So if others have different information.
It actually depends on the type of pain and where it's located.
Okay.
So the difficulty there, I think Ricky is absolutely right. We have insufficient knowledge to date, but there is growing knowledge because there has been substantial investment by NIH in this in the last 5 years. However, it's using federally approved cannabis, which is not the same product available in the market. What we know is that we have cannabinoid receptors that operate in 3 principal areas of our body: the central nervous system, our immune system, as well as our appetite regulation system. Within the central nervous system, which is where we would get the effects for pain, what we understand is that we have cannabinoid receptors both in the brain as well as all over the body, and we have more receptors of cannabis than we do of opioid receptors throughout the body, which is why certain cannabinoids have been deemed to be better, more effective at addressing pain, certain types of pain, because of the presence of the cannabinoid receptors. What we don't know yet very well is whether it is CBD, THC, or the combination of them, or the combination of these 2 cannabinoids in combination with other cannabinoids in the plant, where there's over 140 that have been identified thus far, that are important for creating the therapeutic benefit. And that's where the research is really trying to explode right now. There's a lot of effort to try to get these answers as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We do have another question for Dr. Bluthenthal. Has there been research to show that people can be weaned off of a strong opioid habit by using cannabis? Or is the movement more towards getting people to use cannabis before even touching opioids?
So there are some small studies, I think, that have been published that support the idea of people using cannabis to not, as opposed to opiates. So there's some studies, but I don't think anything definitive is my understanding of the literature. And then from my perspective, I would not regard cannabis as, well, let me back up. So the folks that I see in my studies have used illicit substances for a long time, right? And so the substitution benefits, I think, are pretty substantial for that group. I don't think you can make an argument that having people who haven't used those more serious drugs, that having more cannabis available in some way prevents that from happening in the future, if I'm understanding the question correctly. So I don't think that, like, for instance, if we have more cannabis available, that means we'll end up having fewer people with opiate use disorder. So I don't think it works that way at a population level. There is some evidence that it works for people who have opiate use disorder, for them using cannabis in some limited cases appears to reduce their opiate use.
And then we have another question. How do you keep heroin addicts from selling their medicinal marijuana to fund their heroin?
Well, the price points, here's a dirty secret about illicit substances. Heroin is obscenely inexpensive. So if they have money and they're committed chronic heroin users, they'll use that money to buy heroin. They're not going to go to the trouble of buying cannabis, which is much more expensive, and then selling that to someone to support their cannabis, their heroin habit. So it's, you know, I don't think, even in Vancouver, for instance, and we do ask questions about the different income generation strategies that people use to support their heroin use. I don't think cannabis is a popular way of doing that, even if you're getting it.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have any more specific questions for you, but I welcome all of our panelists to return for some general questions. Okay, so the first general question that we have is, how does one go about creating their own strain of weed?
Legally or just physically? I mean, it's a plant. It's you can create any hybrid you want, or better yet, extract oils from existing plants and chemically put together a new combination. Whether you need to patent it is a question of whether you're trying to get the plant patented or the concentrate, but given the federal prohibition, neither is advised.
Okay, very good. That was an interesting question. And then what institutions do you consider thought leaders on the effects of medicinal cannabis?
I would say that there's a very good journal that is managed by the editors at the University of California, Irvine, Daniele Piamelli, who's doing a lot of work related on the chemical level. It's pharmacotherapy and neurochemistry effects related to cannabis. Ziva Cooper, who's at UCLA, and her colleagues are also doing some very good research, as is Yasmin Hurd at Columbia University. Those are the ones that come immediately. Oh, and then Ryan Vandry at Johns Hopkins University.
What about the UC San Diego group? They're focused on veterans.
Yeah, I think that that's another really good group. They do more of the real world observation. I was thinking of the bench science aspects of it. So you're absolutely right.
Any other thoughts on that question? Okay, here comes another one. What is the best way to stay up to date on cannabis-related information and laws? And is there any specific source we can always utilize?
So there's a resource that I use all the time. It's the Canna Law blog by Harris Bricken, which is a law firm that has been pretty much on the cutting edge of cannabis law for years. And they provide some pretty timely blog posts and updates. So I would start there. And then if you're particularly interested in licensing, I would look at your local city's cannabis department website for updates because it's just a more local thing. And then there are updates that come from the state level. There are various state agencies that provide pretty regular email updates. You can easily sign up for listservs.
Any other resources? Okay. What are the impacts of legal marijuana use with regards to employment, drug test policies, and practices?
That's a great question. I was going to let the lawyer answer.
It is a good question. And it's one that we kind of touched about in the opening remarks. So employers do still have the ability to impose, zero tolerance policies, no use on the job types of policies. And there is actually a very well-developed area. It's like a sub-area of employment and labor law. So if you have particular interest in this area or concerns, I strongly recommend reaching out to an employment attorney, because there are different nuances that come into play. You know, if you are using cannabis and marijuana for medicinal purposes and you have a prescription, There may be other protections that come into place that might not apply if you're using it recreationally. So it's complicated is the short answer, but generally the default rule is your employer can still have a policy that prohibits use.
I would add that it's even made more complicated by the fact that our testing for cannabis right now is very, very archaic and is inadequate to do a very good job of identifying either the actual impairment of the individual at the time of testing or just the presence of the substance.
And then going back to the previous question, can we name the law firm that was mentioned again when talking about the resources?
Sure, the law firm is Harris Bricken, and the website is Canna Law Blog.
Okay, great. Okay. And then another question, can you discuss the class action case against LA and how the reparations policy were affected or not affected?
Sure. So that case is actually pretty interesting, and we can share the complaint with the attendees, I think, if people are interested. But essentially what happened in the city of Los Angeles is they had 3 phases of applications for city business licenses for cannabis retailers, manufacturers, distributors, and other types of businesses. The social equity application process was an online process that was supposed to open on a specific date in September. The timing of the application's opening was critical because there were over 1,000 applicants for only less than 100, really a handful of available licenses. So it was really important to get in the queue early to get your application recognized as complete, on the books, and under review right away. There was a glitch in the system that allowed about 200 applications to be filed before the application process officially opened to the public, which created all sorts of problems, in terms of fairness, in terms of people getting their applications reviewed in a fair way. And yes, we can type the name of the firm in the comments. But so the issue is, if people, and there's some allegations that there were large companies, that were able to find some technical glitch or maybe hack into the system. And so they got the advantage. But the lawsuit essentially is filed by an organization that represents minority applicants who applied for the social equity license, were harmed because the program, once the glitch was discovered, the city shut down the entire application process to do an audit. So what happened is, in order to apply, you had to have a space, which means you had to have a lease. So you're incurring thousands of dollars every month for the lease that you can't even open a business at because you don't have a license. And now the entire application process is delayed, so you don't know when you will know whether you'll have a license. And then all these other costs that the applicants were incurring every single month that this audit was happening. And then the city did take a response after the audit was completed that people just didn't feel was adequate. So the lawsuit is pending. It was just filed this month, and it will be really interesting to see what happens out of that, because it could set a precedent for other social equity programs throughout the state, which also have had various levels of success.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. And now we have questions keep coming. This is wonderful. So the next question that we have are, what are the long-term impacts for prolonged marijuana use?
So you broke up a little bit when you were asking the question. Can you ask it again?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. good. So the question is, what are the impacts and risk factors for prolonged marijuana use?
Jane, I was going to let you handle this one.
Sure. So the short answer is we don't know. There is increasing research on some of the harms of cannabis use, but as was referred to earlier, cannabis is still considered a Schedule I drug, so it's illegal at the federal level, making it difficult to study. There have been some studies in certain areas, but we don't have enough data yet to really assess the long-term impacts. What we do know is the harm to teenage brains. There has been studies on brain development among youth, but as far as I know, we really haven't, and particularly, by the way, because the concentrates and the THC levels that are so much higher than they were back in your parents' or grandparents' day, that we just don't have enough years of data yet to really assess what is the long-term impact of using concentrates or wax or some of these higher potency products. Rosalie, you may have something to add.
No, I was just going to say there are a few longitudinal studies that have been conducted in other countries, but exactly as Jane said, the potency of the product is so different than what we are seeing in the market today that the relevance of that information is highly low. We don't know what the implications are of the higher potency products, except for the fact that higher potency products do increase the risk of becoming addicted for individuals, particularly if they start at an early age.
Thank you so much. We have another question. The University of Mississippi is the only organization currently allowed to study marijuana as opposed to hemp by the federal government. Is that the case? And what are the prospects of other entities being allowed to study marijuana?
It's not that they're the only university allowed to study it. It's that they were the only university allowed to grow it for federally funded studies. That is actually, the laws changed. They have now agreed that they need to allow up to 5 organizations to grow for studies. The second one has come online. The other 3 are still under development. And the goal is to try to make available products that are more consistent with what's available in the market. That said, many states in their legalization policies have set aside funding for conducting research, and that funding can be used to study current products and the impacts of those products. The problem that researchers experience when they use products from the store is these are not products that are consistently developed in the same way. One of the major hindrances for conducting reliable research on products that are sold in retail markets is that we don't have the equivalent of an FDA that ensures that a product is being produced in the same consistent way and is being checked in terms of potential side effects and the like. This is not a function that state governments have consistently taken on. That's always been the role of the federal government. And so it's an area of weak law in the states because the states haven't typically had the resources or the jurisdiction to do this. Because of that, when you go into a store, the names of these products look interesting and might sound similar across stores, but you have no way of knowing if they're actually the same product or not. While labeling is encouraged and required in all states, the testing that's done of these products is done by industries that are paid for by the cannabis industry and not by an independent organization. Several states are trying to change that and have testing done by independent labs, but in order for a lab to do testing of cannabis products, which are federally prohibited, they have to give up any federal lab work funded by the federal government. In other words, they're making their business entirely off of the cannabis industry. So the research has shown that this system has led to very inconsistent information on the ingredients of products that are being sold. When researchers go in, see a label, take a product, see a label, then go home and test it in a lab, of their own, the ratios of THC and CBD are not consistent with what's on the label.
And just to add that even you see this in the legal market where oftentimes there's inconsistency. So it's not just a matter of legal versus illegal.
I was actually referring to legal market. These studies I was referring to was actually done in Washington State in the stores.
Right.
And we have another comment in response to that. But isn't it true that because it's a plant, you couldn't really have the kind of uniformity that an agency like a FDA would need?
It's a fair point, which is why a lot of the pharmaceutical companies that are interested in producing marijuana-derived or based medications actually use extracts and then create a concentrate or a liquid or a tincture in order to deliver the product, even an edible, because then you have much more consistency. And by the way, you have a process that can be patented for legal protection. The FDA does not, any plant is going to have natural variability. And so it's one of the difficulties, and that was part of the reason why cannabis initially got put on as a Schedule I drug, was because it was technically a plant.
Okay, any other comment on that? Okay, very well. Another question.
Let me bring up, Renee, can I?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's not precisely related, but I just want to make sure that I mention it because I think it's a big concern. So given what Rosalie just shared about the inconsistencies in the product, you know, one of the things we do need urgently, and I think maybe Jane, you talked about this, is we need some regulation on the advertising. There are real dangers when people go into the dispensaries or are told, well, this works on this works on that, and they just don't know. So I'm fine if people believe it has a particular impact, and I'm open to them using it in a way that makes sense to them. But it shouldn't be part of the business model that companies are allowed to make claims about what it does or doesn't do without actual evidence. And there's some advertising, and Chelsea Shover has a good presentation, I think it might be a publication now, talking about some of the abuses that are going on in some of the advertising. And in fact, some groups have made claims, for instance, that if you have an opiate use disorder and you're taking buprenorphine or methadone, that you can substitute cannabis for those proven efficacious medications. And you can't. That's grossly irresponsible and very dangerous, both to individual and community health. So at some level, we have to begin having adult conversations about how to actually manage these products. Because there are dangers out there, particularly as it becomes commercialized, and those interests begin to subvert the other interests of communities and individuals.
Just to kind of add on to what Ricky was saying about advertising and false claims that are going into advertising, the FDA and the FTC have been cracking down pretty recently on businesses that are making medical claims in products. And so the problem is enforcement, right? If you're a company and you figure, well, I can make these claims, I'll make my products, and there will be some lead time before I get caught. And if I do get caught, I'll just get a letter from the FTC or the FDA. I'll get a cease and desist letter, and then I'll get time to cure the violation, which means I'll just remove any unsold products off of the market. But in the meantime, I can make so much money off of it. So you still have these claims and this marketing happening, even though it's in violation of federal law. And in California, there are additional regulations on marketing and advertising. Like, you can't say that a product is from a particular place unless you have evidence, and you can't make health claims. So it's just, it's an issue of enforcement.
What are the limitations for physicians who support the use of medical cannabis in their patients but are not specialists?
That's a really important question, and it's one that I've been getting a lot lately in presentations I've been giving to various physician groups. We will know a lot more in the next 6 to 9 months because there are large physician organizations that are doing real world clinical trials right now and observational studies where they're either finding out, for example, in Kaiser, they're having discussions with patients about their cannabis use, both medically and recreationally, and in places of Washington State and California where it's legal both medically and recreationally, so that those conversations can be had, but many physicians have been uncomfortable doing so. I think the issue for any physician, whether a specialist or a family practitioner, is to try to first understand what the purpose of the inquiry is, or why is an individual using cannabis, and what is their standard practice in terms of, do they get up and need to use first thing in the morning, or do they take it occasionally at the end of the day? There's information about how you use a substance that can provide information as to whether or not this is a potentially addictive pattern of behavior or just casual use like another product that they're in control of. I think most individuals, the intent of these laws is that cannabis use, when used properly and in moderation, is not all that harmful, assuming that it's not a naive user who's exposed to a very high potency product, in which case there can be some very serious acute responses. We are learning of more consequences of high repeated use of high dose potency. Cannabis hypermesis is a common condition we're seeing in the emergency departments, which is only seen in regular vaping patients. And so from a physician's perspective, understanding the use behavior, understanding the motivations for using can be helpful in understanding whether or not for this individual cannabis use is a health concern or not. So which products to recommend? I can't say we have any good information on that yet.
Mm-hmm. And so just a follow up to that, at what point do you feel it would be important to refer to a specialist, a pain management specialist or a substance abuse specialist? At what point do you think that would be necessary?
Well, there are screeners for cannabis use disorder. If somebody's using just for non-pain reasons but has become addicted. If the individual is using to deal with a chronic pain issue or an acute pain issue, then the need to refer really is the nature of the pain itself. I think you would use the same tools, a screener, again, getting at the motivations for use and the frequencies of use, the amount, and then from that make a decision as to whether it's appropriate for a referral or not. If they meet criteria for abuse or dependence, using one of the cannabis use disorder screeners, or if they have make other mention of pain or PTSD or some of the other conditions that cannabis has frequently been believed to have therapeutic benefits for. Seizures is one where you should definitely be referring the person to a specialist. If they're having seizures and they're using cannabis for seizures, but they're not seeing a specialist, that seems like a bad situation.
Agreed. And as a family physician, I wholeheartedly agree with that. Anything outside the scope of what you are comfortable with and knowledgeable about, bring in reinforcements and consult with your specialist. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then we have another general question, okay? Someone asked, what is the difference between the flower and the concentrate?
So the flower refers typically to the bud, which is the part of the plant material that contains the most THC throughout the plant. There actually are very small traces amount of THC in other parts of the plant, but the bud has the most amount of it. A concentrate is produced after extracting the oils that are natural in the plant. And once you have the oils extracted, you can separate the various cannabinoids that are present in that oil, the THC, the CBD, the other 140 different cannabinoids, as well as terpenes, and chemically synthesize the types of products you want, put them in a new medium, and create a new liquid or concentrate from that. It's just a chemical process, not unlike making olive oil or avocado oil or vegetable oil of any other nature.
Okay, very interesting. And then we have, what do you think is in the future for the cannabis industry in the next year? And what types of shifts do you see happening in the industry?
I tried to answer that question by saying we're not really sure. However, it's very helpful to subscribe to cannabis company websites to kind of see what they're thinking and what they're doing. And I think because there's, at least in California, a ban on the sale of cannabis and home delivery in most of the jurisdictions in California, and that's where a lot of the money is made, is in the home delivery realm, that with COVID-19 being an essential service, or excuse me, with cannabis delivery and sales being an essential service now, it will probably open up, pave the way for other jurisdictions to allow home delivery post-COVID that didn't before. So that has been discussed in the industry as a potential win. But still we have, the unlicensed market, right, to compete with. And that's there's a lot of tension there with the taxation, which is a benefit because that helps fund programs, but it also drives people to the black market. So that's a big question mark in terms of the future of the industry. And maybe the other panelists could weigh in.
I would say hemp is certainly on the horizon of the, all things hemp. With the federal farm bill allowing for the industrial production of hemp, you'll see it as it's already, you see gum, cannabis, CBD gum, CBD ice cream. You've got all sorts of different new products that are coming out, and without any federal regulation in terms of the types of products that can be used, the extracts can be used to produce. You'll see more. We already have hemp CBD wine. We have a whole range of different drinks. I think the other big signal that we're getting from the industry relates to vaping. And why I say that is because we know there's been tremendous growth in tobacco vaping among kids, growing growth, certainly increases in cannabis vaping. And the tobacco industry knows if you get an early user, you've got a lifetime user. So while vaping is, I think cannabis and tobacco vape e-cigarettes are two very similar products, not because of the negative reasons you might believe, but they both have very positive potential value. And yet they also, when targeted to the wrong people, can have negative consequences. So it's not the nature of the product itself that's good or bad, but the guidelines that you place around the industry that facilitates the beneficial use and not a negative consequential use.
Mm-hmm.
From the legal side, some developments that I see coming down the road in the near future are, one is in terms of legalization. There are some predictions that legalization could spread to up to 40 states as a result of elections in November. So even though it may not be legal at the federal level, you'll start to see more widespread legalization at the state level, which of course will lead to pressure for the federal government to take a different position sometime soon. Another big thing that we're seeing in the legal industry is intellectual property rights in the cannabis space. So initially, one of the other panelists mentioned, you go to the stores, you see a product using a certain name, and you don't know if it's the same product that you might see at another store with the same name or a similar name. As branding has become really important and you start to have affiliation with celebrities, then intellectual property is becoming really, really critical to cannabis businesses. And so they're looking at creative ways to protect their trademarks and copyrights outside of the traditional federal laws, which of course you can't really trademark or copyright. You can't have intellectual property for something that's illegal under federal law. So there are nuances developing there. And lastly, one thing that I'm seeing is, it's so difficult for businesses in this space to have access to money because banks still are not insured against cannabis related money. There's concerns about money laundering, implications of allowing cannabis companies to bank. And so we're seeing a lot of private equity firms get into the space, and they're looking at how they can offer secured loans to allow businesses to grow and get past that initial growth stage. And so there's just some really creative financing and stock options that might be coming down the road. And then related to financing, in other countries like Canada, cannabis is sold, not the cannabis product itself, but stocks in the companies are sold on stock markets. And so again, there's going to be some pressure if it expands to several other countries for, some similar changes in the US.
And it said, you mentioned the limited amount of cannabis business licenses that were distributed in Los Angeles and an even smaller amount of social equity cannabis licenses that were distributed. Do you know if all the social equity licenses have been given out at this point?
At this point, the process is pretty much on hold. Because there was the audit, because there was the allegation of unfairness and a glitch in the system, there was not a way for the cities to actually process the applications that had come in a way that was fair to everyone. So they put the system on pause while they did their audit. And now that there's a lawsuit pending, you can bet that the lawsuit will ask for a preliminary injunction, which would be a court order preventing the city from taking any further action on processing or issuing any of those licenses. So I would say, the process is out there, it's pending, but no social equity licenses have been issued because the process is the subject of active litigation.
I guess I would say, I think that the transition to legalization has obviously been successful for a number of reasons, but is still an experiment in process and needs to be carefully considered in the areas of law where we aren't being as careful because of having in other areas of other products a federal partner. Should the federal government change their position, which is possible for the reasons already stated, then it won't be necessary, but that's still uncertain. And so in terms of regulation of the product and making sure there's more product consistency, from a consumer standpoint, people are willing to pay a little bit more in a legal market if the quality of the product and the product that they're purchasing is known and not risky. If we can provide that in our legal market, then we'll have the ability to do the higher prices and taxes because of the comfort of having a safe, known product that could be produced. And I think there's a lot of work we can do in that regard.
I just want to say thank you to our panelists. That was so much more than I had hoped that it would be from each and every one of you. I'm going to continue to review those slides and get deeper into my own personal research. But I just thought it was, you all did a phenomenal job. And I want to thank the Association of Black Women Physicians for joining with us again for another joint symposium. And we look forward to doing this every year. And I just want to thank everybody for coming and for attending this evening, and hope you got as much out of it as I did. and we will see you next year.